I suggest that we try to find any media outlet to do an expose on the Federal Reserve Board, which is what I did. I took my article, which was a good expose of the greatest swindle on earth, to every major newspaper, radio, and television station, magazine house, and several talk show hosts. A few made promises that sounded good. They would definitely air the article and have me discuss it. Give them about a week, and they would get back to me. Not one of them ever did, nor did my article ever appear in the pages of their newspapers and journals. It was as if a blanket of silence had been thrown over me and the subject I was endeavoring to promote, and indeed that was precisely what had happened. Without massive media hype and without almost around-the-clock coverage, the hippie beatnik rock drug cult would never have gotten off the ground. It would have remained a localized oddity. The Beatles, with their twanging guitars, silly expressions, drug language, and weird clothes, would not have amounted to a hill of beans. Instead, because the Beatles were given saturation coverage by the media, the United States has suffered one cultural shock after another. The men buried in the think tanks and research institutions, whose names and faces are still not known to but a few people, made sure that the press played its part. Conversely, the media's important role in not exposing the power behind the future cultural shocks made certain that the source of the crisis was never identified. Thus was our society driven mad through psychological shocks and stress. Driven mad is taken from Tavistock's training manual. From its modest beginnings in 1921, Tavistock was ready in 1966 to launch a major, irreversible cultural revolution in America, which has not yet ended. The Aquarian conspiracy is part of it. Thus softened up, our nation was now deemed ripe for the introduction of drugs, which was to rival the Prohibition era in scope and the huge amounts of money to be made. This, too, was an integral part of the Aquarian conspiracy. The proliferation of drug usage was one of the subjects under study at the Science Policy Research Unit, SPRU, at Tavistock's Sussex University facility. It was known as the Future Shocks Center, a title given to so-called future-oriented psychology designed to manipulate whole population groups to induce future shocks. It was the first of several such institutions set up by Tavistock. Future shocks is described as a series of events which come so fast that the human brain cannot absorb the information. As I said earlier, science has shown that there are clearly marked limits to the amount of changes and the nature of them that the mind can deal with. After continuous shocks, the large targeted population group discovers that it does not want to make choices anymore. Apathy takes over, often preceded by mindless violence, such as is characteristic of the Los Angeles street gangs, serial killers, rapists, and child kidnappers. Such a group becomes easy to control and will docilely follow orders without rebelling, which is the object of the exercise. Future shocks, says Spru, is defined as physical and psychological distress arising from the excess load on the decision-making mechanism of the human mind. That is Tavistock jargon lifted straight from Tavistock manuals, which they don't know I have. Just as an overloaded electrical circuit will activate a trip switch, so do humans trip out, which is a syndrome that medical science is only now beginning to understand, although John Rawlings Rees conducted experiments in this field as far back as the 1920s. As can be appreciated, such a targeted group is ready to trip out and take to drugs as a means of escape from the pressures of so many choices having to be made. This is how drug usage was spread so rapidly through America's Beat generation. What started with the Beatles and sample packages of LSD has grown into a flood tide of drug usage which is swamping America. The drug trade is controlled by the Committee of 300 from the top down. The drug trade started with the British East India Company and was closely followed by the Dutch East India Company. Both were controlled by a Council of 300. The list of names of members and stockholders of the BEIC read like something out of Debrett's Peerage. BIC established the China Inland Mission, whose job it was to get the Chinese peasants, or coolies as they were called, addicted to opium. This created the market for opium which the BIC then filled. In much the same way the Committee of 300 used the Beatles to popularize social drugs with the youth of America and the Hollywood in crowd. Ed Sullivan was sent to England to become acquainted with the first Tavistock Institute rock group to hit the shores of the United States. Sullivan then returned to the United States to draft the strategy for the electronic media on how to package and sell the group. Without the full cooperation of the electronic media, and Ed Sullivan in particular, the Beatles and their music would have died on the vine. Instead, our national life and the character of the United States was forever changed. Now that we know, it is all too clear how successful the Beatles' campaign to proliferate the use of drugs became. The fact that the Beatles had their music and lyrics written for them by Theo Adorno was concealed from public view. The prime function to the Beatles was to be discovered by teenagers, who were then subjected to a non-stop barrage of Beatle music until they became convinced that they liked the sound and adopted it, along with all that accompanied it. The Liverpool group performed up to expectations, and with a little help from their friends, that is, illegal substances we call drugs, created a whole new class to young Americans in the precise mold ordained by the Tavistock Institute. Tavistock had created a highly visible new type to act as their drug runners. The China Inland Mission Christian missionaries would not have fitted in with the 1960s. New type is social science scientist jargon. What it meant was that the Beatles created new social patterns, first and foremost being to normalize and popularize the use of drugs, new tastes in clothes and hairstyles, which really distinguished them from the older generation as was intended by Tavistock. It is important to note the deliberate fragmentation-inducing language used by Tavistock. The teenagers never once dreamed that all the different things they aspired to were the product of older scientists working in think tanks in England and Stanford research. How mortified they would have been if they had discovered that most of their cool habits and expressions were deliberately created for their use by a group of older social science scientists. The role of the media was, and remains, very important in promoting the use of drugs on a nationwide scale. When coverage of the street warfare gangs was abruptly terminated by the media, they became burned out as a social phenomena. The new age of drugs followed. The media has always served as a catalyst and has always pushed new causes, and now media attention was focused on drug usage and its supporters, the Beat Generation, yet another phrase fashioned at Tavistock, in its determined efforts to bring about social changes in the United States. Drug usage now became an accepted part of everyday life in America. This Tavistock-designed program took in millions of American youth, and the older generation began to believe that America was undergoing a natural social revolution, failing all the while to realize that what was happening to their children was not a spontaneous movement, but a highly artificial creation designed to force changes in America's social and political life. The descendants of the British East India Company were delighted with the success of their drug-pushing program. Their disciples became adept in the use of lysergic acid, LSD, so conveniently made available by patrons of the drug trade like Aldous Huxley, courtesy of the highly respected Sandoz Company of Switzerland and financed by the Great Warburg banking dynasty. The new wonder drug was promptly distributed at all rock concerts and on college campuses in free sample packages. The question that begs to be asked is, what was the FBI doing while all this was going on? The purpose of the Beatles had become abundantly clear. The British East India Company's descendants in the upper-class society in London must have felt very good about the billions of dollars that began rolling in. With the coming of rock, which shall henceforth be used as shorthand to describe Adorno's fiendish, satanic music, a tremendous increase in the use of social drugs, especially marijuana, was observed. The entire dope business was expanded under the control and direction of the Science Policy Research Unit, SPRU. SPRU was run by Leland Bradford, Kenneth Dam, and Ronald Lippert, under whose expert guidance a large number of new science scientists were trained to promote future shocks. one of the chief being the dramatic increase in the use of drugs by America's teenagers. SPRU's policy papers, planted in various government agencies, including the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, dictated the course of the disastrous drug war allegedly waged by the Reagan and Bush administrations. This was the forerunner of how the United States is run today, by one committee and/or council after another, by an inner government fed on TAVISTOCK papers which they firmly believe are their own opinions. These virtual unknowns are making decisions that will forever change our form of government and the quality of life here in the United States. Through crisis adaptation, we have already been changed so much as to barely compare with what we were in the 1950s. Also, our environment has been changed. There is much talk about environment these days, and while it mostly refers to green surroundings, pure rivers, and fresh air, there is another equally important environment, namely the drug environment. The environment of our lifestyle has become polluted. Our thinking has become polluted. Our ability to control our destiny has become polluted. We are confronted by changes that pollute our thinking to the extent that we do not know what to make of it all. The environment of change is crippling the nation. We appear to have so little control that it has produced anxiety and confusion. We now look to group solutions instead of individual solutions to our problems. We do not make use of our own resources to solve problems. In this, the prolific rise in drug usage is playing a leading role. The strategy is a deliberate one, devised by the new scientists, the social engineers and tinkerers, aimed at the most vulnerable of all areas, our self-image, or how we perceive ourselves, which leads us eventually to become like sheep being led to the slaughter. We have become confused by the many choices we have to make, and we have become apathetic. We are manipulated by unscrupulous men without ever being aware of it. This is particularly true of the drug trade, and we are now in the transition stage where we can be set up for a change from the present constitutional form of government, which has taken a giant step forward under the Bush administration. While there are those who still persist, in the face of all of the evidence to the contrary in saying, "It can't happen in America," the fact is, it has already happened. Our will to resist events not to our liking has been steadily eroded and undermined. We will resist, some of us say, but not so many of us will do that, and we will be in the minority. The drug trade has insidiously changed our environment. The alleged war on drugs is a farce. It does not exist in qualitative measure to make the slightest difference to the descendants of the British East India Company. Combined with computerization, we are almost fully brainwashed, robbed of our ability to resist forced changes. Which brings us to another environment, people control, also known as personal information control, without which governments cannot play their numbers game. As matters stand, we the people have absolutely no way of knowing just what government does or does not know about us. Government computer files are not subject to scrutiny by the public at large. Do we foolishly believe that personal information's sacrosanct? Remember, in every society there are rich and powerful families who control law enforcement agencies. I have proved the existence of such families. Do not think that if these families wanted to find out about us, they could not do so. These are the families who often have a member in the Committee of 300. Take Kissinger, for instance, who has his own private dossiers on hundreds of thousands of people, not only in the U.S. but all over the world. Are we on Kissinger's enemy list? Is this far-fetched? Not at all. Take P2 Masonic and Committee Monte Carlo, who have such lists which run into tens of thousands of names. Incidentally, Kissinger is one of them. There are other private intelligence agencies, such as Intel, whom we shall meet later. One of the ways heroin is moved into Europe is through the Principality of Monaco. The heroin comes from Corsica, carried in ferries that ply a busy trade between Corsica and Monte Carlo during the summer. There is no check of what goes on or comes off these ferries. As there is no border between France and Monaco, drugs, and more especially heroin, partly processed opium, flows through the open border of Monaco into laboratories in France, or else if it has already been processed into heroin, it goes directly to the distributors. The Grimaldi family has been in the drug smuggling business for centuries. Because Prince Ranier got greedy and began skimming heavily and would not desist after 3 warnings, his wife, Princess Grace, was murdered in a car accident. Ranier underestimated the power of the committee of which he is a member. The rover car in which she was traveling had the brake fluid chambers tampered with in such a way that each time the brakes were depressed, fluid was released in measured amount, until by the time the car reached the most dangerous of several hairpin bends, there was no stopping power, and it sailed over a stone wall, hitting the ground 50 feet below in a sickening smash. Everything possible was done by the committee of 300 operatives to conceal the truth about the murder of Princess Grace. To this day, the rover car remains in the custody of French police, shrouded under a cover on a trailer which no one is allowed to approach, let alone examine. The signal for the execution of Princess Grace was picked up by the British Army listening post in Cyprus, and it is believed by well-placed source that the Committee Monte Carlo and P2 gave the order. The drug trade, controlled by the Committee of 300, is a crime against humanity, but having been conditioned and softened up by years of incessant bombardment by TAVISTOCK Institute, we have more or less accepted our changed environment regarding the drug trade as a problem that is too big to handle. This is not the case. If we could marshal an entire nation, equip and send millions of American soldiers to fight in a war in Europe in which he had no business intervening, if we could defeat a major power, then we can smash the drug trade using the same WW2 tactics. The logistical problems that had to be solved when we entered the Second World War are even today still mind-boggling, yet we successfully overcame all problems. Why then is it impossible to defeat a well-defined enemy, far smaller and weaker than Germany, given the immensely improved weapons and surveillance equipment we have today? The real reason that the drug problem is not eradicated is because it is being run by the highest families in the entire world as part of a coordinated, gigantic money-making machine. In 1930, British capital invested in South America greatly exceeded capital investment in British dominions. Graham, an authority on British investments abroad, stated that British investment in South America exceeded £1 trillion. Remember, this was 1930, and £1 trillion was a staggering sum of money in those days. What was the reason for such heavy investment in South America? In a word, it was drugs. The plutocracy controlling British banks held the purse strings and then, as now, put up a most respectable facade to cover their true business. No one ever caught them with dirtied hands. They always had front men, even as they do today, willing to take the blame if things went awry. Then, as now, the connections with the drug trade were tenuous at best. No one was ever able to lay a finger on the respectable and noble banking families of Britain, whose members are on the Committee of 300. There is great significance in that only 15 members of Parliament were the controllers of that vast empire, of which the most prominent were Sir Charles Barry and the Chamberlain family. These overlords of finance were busy in places like Argentina, Jamaica, and Trinidad, which became big money spinners for them through the drug trade. In these countries, British plutocrats kept the locals, as they were contemptuously called, at bare subsistence levels, hardly above slavery. The fortunes extracted from the drug trade in the Caribbean were vast. The plutocrats hid behind faces like Trinidad Leaseholds Limited, but the real meat, then as now, was drugs. This is true of today, where we find that Jamaica's gross national product, GNP, is made up almost entirely of sales of ganja, a very potent form of marijuana. The mechanism for handling the ganja trade was set up by David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger under the title Caribbean Basin Initiative. Up until a relatively short time ago, the true history of the China opium trade was quite unknown, having been as well covered up as it is possible to do. Many of my former students in the days when I was lecturing would come and ask me why the Chinese were so fond of smoking opium. They were puzzled, as are many still today, over contradictory accounts of what had actually taken place in China. Most thought it was merely a case of the Chinese workers buying opium on an open market and smoking it, or going to some of the thousands of opium dens and forgetting their terrible existence for a while. The truth is that the supply of opium to China was a British monopoly, an official monopoly of the British government and official British policy. The Indo-British opium trade in China was one of the best-kept secrets, around which many misleading legends grew up, such as Clive of India and the tales of daring do by the British Army in India for the glory of the empire, so well written by Rudyard Kipling, and tales of tea clippers racing across the oceans with their cargoes of China tea for the high society drawing rooms of Victorian England. In reality, the history of British occupation of India and Britain's opium wars are some of the most dastardly blots on Western civilization. Almost 13% of the income of India under British rule was derived from the sale of good-quality Bengal opium to the British-run opium distributors in China. The Beatles of the day, the China Inland Mission, had done a great job in proliferating the use of opium among the poor Chinese laborers, coolies, as they were called. These addicts did not suddenly materialize out of thin air, any more than did teenager addicts in the U.S. The point to remember is that both were created. In China, a market for opium was first created and then filled by opium for Bengal. In the same way, a market for marijuana and LSD was first created in the United States by methods already described and then filled by British plutocrats and their American cousins with the help of the overlords of the British banking establishment. The lucrative drug trade is one of the worst examples of making money out of human misery. The other being the legal drug trade run by the pharmaceutical drug houses under Rockefeller ownership in the U.S. for the most part, but with substantial companies operating in Switzerland, France, and Britain, and fully backed by the American Medical Association, AMA. The dirty dope transactions and the money it generates flows through the city of London, together with Hong Kong, Dubai, and latterly Lebanon, thanks to the invasion of that country by Israel. There will be those who doubt this statement. Look at this business columns of the Financial Times, they will tell us. Don't tell me that this is all related to drug money. Of course it is, but don't imagine for 1 minute that the noble lords and ladies of England are going to advertise the fact. Remember the British East India Company? Officially, its business was trading in tea. The London Times never dared tell the British public that it was impossible to make vast profits from tea, nor did the illustrious paper even hint at a trade in opium being plied by those who spent their time in London's fashionable clubs or playing a chukka of polo at the Royal Windsor Club, or that the gentlemen officers who went out to India in the service of the Empire were financed solely by the enormous income derived from the misery of the millions of Chinese coolies addicted to opium. The trade was conducted by the illustrious British East India Company, whose meddling in political, religious, and economic affairs of the United States has cost us very dearly for over 200 years. The 300 members of the British East India Company's board were a cut above the common herd. They were so mighty, as Lord Bertrand Russell once observed, they could even give God advice when he had trouble in heaven. Nor should we imagine that anything has changed in the intervening years. Exactly the same attitude prevails today among members of the Committee of 300, which is why they often refer to themselves as the Olympians. Later, the British Crown, that is, the royal family, joined the British East India Company's trade and used it as a vehicle to produce opium in Bengal and elsewhere in India, controlling exports through what was called transit duties. That is, the Crown levied a tax on all producers of opium duly registered with the state authority, who were sending their opium to China. Prior to 1896, when the trade was still illegal, a word used to extract greater tribute from the producers of opium, there never having been the slightest attempt to stop the trade, colossal amounts of opium were shipped out of India on board China tea clippers, those sailing ships around which legend and lore were built, which supposedly carried chests of tea from India and China to the London exchanges. So audacious did the British East India Company lords and ladies become that they tried to sell this lethal substance to the Union and Confederate armies in pill form as a painkiller. Is it difficult to imagine just what would have happened had their plan succeeded? All those hundreds of thousands of soldiers would have left the battlefields totally hooked on opium. The Beatles were much more successful in turning out millions of teenage addicts in later years. The Bengal merchants and their British controllers and bankers grew fat and intolerant on the enormous amounts of money that poured into the coffers of the British East India Company from the wretched Chinese coolies' opium trade. BIC profits, even in those years, far exceeded the combined profits made in a single year by General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler in their heydays. The trend in making huge profits out of drugs was carried over into the 1960s by such legal drug death merchants as Sandoz, the makers of LSD, and Hoffmann-La Roche, manufacturers of Valium. The cost of the raw material and manufacturing of Valium to Hoffmann-La Roche is $3 per kilo, 2.2 pounds. It is sold to their distributors for $20,000 per kilo. By the time it reaches the consumer, the price of Valium has risen to $50,000 per kilo. Valium is used in huge quantities in Europe and the United States. It is possibly the most used drug of its kind in the world. Hoffmann-La Roche does the same thing with vitamin C, which costs them less than 1 cent a kilo to produce. It is sold for a profit of 10,000%. When a friend of mine blew the whistle on this criminal company, which had entered into a monopoly agreement with other producers, in contravention of European Economic Community laws, he was arrested on the Swiss-Italian border and hustled into prison. His wife was threatened by the Swiss police until she committed suicide. As a British national, he was rescued by the British consul in Bern as soon as word of his plight was received, removed from prison, and flown out of the country. He lost his wife, his job, and his pension because he dared to disclose Hoffmann-La Roche secrets. The Swiss take their industrial espionage law very seriously. Remember this the next time you see those lovely advertisements of Swiss ski slopes, beautiful watches, pristine mountains, and cuckoo clocks. That is not what Switzerland is about. It is about dirty, multi-billion-dollar money laundering which is carried out by major Swiss banking houses. It is about the Committee of 300 legal drug manufacturers. Switzerland is the committee's ultimate safe haven for money and protection of their bodies in time of global calamity. Now, mind you, one could get into serious trouble with the Swiss authorities for giving out any information on these nefarious activities. The Swiss regard it as industrial espionage, which usually carries a 5-year term in prison. It is safer to pretend that Switzerland is a nice, clean country rather than look under the covers or inside its garbage can banks. In 1931, the managing directors of the so-called Big Five British companies were rewarded by being made peers of the realm for their activities in drug money laundering. Who decided such matters and bestows such honors? It is the Queen of England who bestows honors upon the men in the top positions in the drug trade. British banks engaged in this terrible trade are too numerous to mention, but a few of the top ones are the British Bank of the Middle East, Midland Bank, National and Westminster Bank, Barclays Bank, Royal Bank of Canada, Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, Baring Brothers Bank. Many of the merchant banks are up to their hocks in pigswill drug trade profits, banks such as Hambros, for example, run by Sir Jocelyn Hambro. For a really interesting major study of the Chinese opium trade, one would need access to India office in London. I was able to get in there because of my intelligence service and received great assistance from the trustee of the papers of the late Professor Frederick Wells Williamson, which provided much information on the opium trade carried on by the British East India Company in India and China in the 18th and 19th centuries. If only those papers could be made public, what a storm would burst over the heads of the crowned vipers of Europe. Today, the trade has shifted somewhat in that less expensive cocaine has taken over a good part of the North American market. In the 1960s, the flood of heroin coming from Hong Kong, Lebanon, and Dubai threatened to engulf the United States and Western Europe. When demand outpaced supply, there was a switch to cocaine. But now, at the end of 1991, that trend has been reversed. Today, it is heroin that is back in favor, although it is true that cocaine still enjoys great favor among the poorer classes. Heroin, we are told, is more satisfying to addicts. The effects are far more intense and last longer than the effects of cocaine, and there is less international attention on heroin producers than there is on Colombian cocaine shippers. Besides which, it is hardly likely that the U.S. would make any real effort to stop the production of opium in the Golden Triangle, which is under the control of the Chinese military. A serious war would erupt if any country tried to interdict the trade. A serious attack on the opium trade would bring Chinese military intervention. The British know this. They have no quarrel with China, except for an occasional squabble over who gets the larger share of the pie. Britain has been involved in the China opium trade for over 2 centuries. No one is going to be so foolish as to rock the boat when millions upon millions of dollars flow into the bank accounts of the British oligarchists and more gold is traded on the Hong Kong gold market than the combined total traded in London and New York. Those individuals who fondly imagine they can do some kind of a deal with a minor Chinese or Burmese overlord in the hills of the Golden Triangle apparently have no idea of what is involved. If they had known, they would never have talked about stopping the opium trade. Such talk reveals little knowledge of the immensity and complexity of China's opium trade. British plutocrats, the Russian KGB, the CIA, and U.S. bankers are all in league with China. Could one man stop or even make a small dent in the trade? It would be absurd to imagine it. What is heroin, and why is it favored over cocaine these days? According to the noted authority on the subject, Professor Galen, heroin is a derivative of opium, a drug that stupefies the senses and induces long periods of sleep. This is what most addicts like. It is called being in the arms of Morpheus. Opium is the most habit-forming drug known to man. Many pharmaceutical drugs contain opium in various degrees, and it is believed that paper used in the manufacture of cigarettes is first impregnated with opium, which is why smokers become so addicted to their habit. The poppy seed from which it is derived was long known to the Moguls of India, who used the seeds mixed in tea offered to a difficult opponent. It is also used as a pain-killing drug, which largely replaced chloroform and other older anesthetics of a bygone era. Opium was popular in all of the fashionable clubs of Victorian London, and it was no secret that men like the Huxley brothers used it extensively. Members of the Orphic Dionysus cults of Hellenic Greece and the Osiris-Horus cults of Ptolemaic Egypt, which Victorian society embraced, all smoked opium. It was the in thing to do. So did some of those who met at St. Ermin's Hotel in 1903 to decide what sort of a world we would have. The descendants of the St. Ermin's crowd are found today in the Committee of 300. It is these so-called world leaders who brought about such a change in our environment that enabled drug usage to proliferate to the point where it can no longer be stopped by regular law enforcement tactics and policies. This is especially true in big cities where big populations can conceal a great deal of what transpires. Many in the circles of royalty were regular opium users. One of their favorites was the writer Coudenhove Kalergi, who wrote a book in 1932 entitled Revolution Through Technology, which was a blueprint for the return of the world to a medieval society. The book, in fact, became a working paper for the Committee of 300's plan to deindustrialize the world, starting with the United States. Claiming that pressures of overpopulation are a serious problem, Kalergi advised a return to what he called open spaces. Does this sound like the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot? Here are some extracts from the book. In its facilities, the city of the future will resemble the city of the Middle Ages, and he who is not condemned to live in a city because of his occupation will go to the countryside. Our civilization is a culture of the major cities. Therefore, it is a marsh plant, born by degenerated, sickly, and decadent people who have voluntarily or involuntarily ended up in this dead-end street of life. Isn't that very close to what Angkor Wat gave as his reasons for depopulating Phnom Penh?